Sometimes a few sheets of paper are enough to change the course of a war. Not divisions, not armored breakthroughs, not bombing campaigns, but documents the enemy believes are real. History has seen many operations where information became the decisive weapon. But in 1943, the Allies went further. They decided to make Germany believe in a reality that had never existed. There is one rule every intelligence service trusts. If a document reaches enemy hands in a natural way, if it is discovered under circumstances that cannot be staged, then it can be trusted. A radio message can be forged, an agent can be exposed, a cipher can be broken, but an officer carrying personal letters, a photograph of his fiancée, and bank receipts in his pocket is no longer an operation. It is a life. And lives, it seemed, could not be manufactured. In the spring of 1943, the Allies were preparing to invade southern Europe. Their true objective was Sicily, the strategic key to Italy and to Mussolini's regime. But the problem was that Sicily was the obvious target. In Berlin, they expected the blow to fall there. German command reinforced the island's defenses, transferred troops, and prepared to repel an amphibious landing. If Hitler became fully convinced of his assumptions, the operation could end in disaster and thousands of dead soldiers. British intelligence understood that what needed to change was not Germany's plans, but Germany's confidence. The German High Command had to believe in a different picture of the war and believe in it willingly, based on evidence they believed they had discovered themselves. It had to look like an accident, a leak, a tragic mistake. Under no circumstances could it appear to be deception, and so an idea was born, one that seemed absurd even by wartime standards. Not through double agents, not through radio deception. The Allies decided to create a man who had never existed, give him a biography, habits, emotions, and debts, and then allow the enemy to find him. If the Germans believed the story, they would shift forces to Greece and the Balkans. If they did not, Sicily would become a trap for the invading Allies. At that moment, the war ceased to be only a clash of armies and fleets. It became a battle for trust, for interpretation, for the ability to distinguish reality from a carefully constructed illusion. In 1943, one British officer decided that the most reliable form of deception was to make the lie so convincing that the enemy would want to believe it. Ewan Montagu was 39 years old. A lawyer by education, an officer of the Royal Navy by service, and a man of cold, analytical temperament by nature. Before the war, he practiced civil law, but with the outbreak of conflict, he found himself in naval intelligence, in a structure where decisions were made not to the sound of gunfire, but to the rustle of papers and reports. His task was to calculate how the enemy would think tomorrow based on what the enemy knew today. By the spring of 1943, the Allies had already determined their plan for the invasion of Europe. Operation Husky called for a landing in Sicily, an island that opened the way into Italy and placed Mussolini's regime under direct threat. The capture of Sicily meant control over the Mediterranean Sea and the possibility of further advance into the Italian peninsula. But strategic logic had its other side. Sicily was too obvious a target. The German command understood this just as clearly as the British. Intelligence reports painted a troubling picture. The Germans were reinforcing garrisons on the island, transferring aircraft there, and strengthening coastal defenses. Hitler had already demonstrated his ability to react quickly to threats, and if he became fully convinced that the main blow would fall on Sicily, the landing could turn into a bloodbath. Every additional division transferred to the island meant hundreds or thousands of Allied soldiers killed. Within the British Admiralty, there was growing awareness that ordinary methods of deception might fail. Radio intercepts were analyzed carefully. Double agents were under constant supervision. German intelligence networks in Spain and Portugal operated actively and professionally. What was needed was a leak of information so believable that it would not look like a trap. The Germans had to reach the conclusion themselves that Greece and Sardinia were the real targets of invasion. The idea of using a body did not appear out of nowhere. British intelligence already had experience creating false documents and constructed identities for agents. But this required something more. Not just papers, but an entire human story. A man who would be mourned, a man who would be buried. Personal belongings that would appear too intimate and too ordinary to be part of an operation. That is why specialists in counterintelligence, forensic medicine, and even officers responsible for small everyday details were brought into the project. That is how Major William Martin came into existence, an officer of the Royal Marines. He was given an age, a service record, a romantic relationship, and even minor financial difficulties. In his pockets there would be letters from his fiancée, bank statements, receipts, and a pass to an officers' club. None of it was for theatrics. It was for trust. Because British intelligence knew the Germans would examine every detail, compare dates, analyze signatures, and observe the behavior of Spanish authorities. Montagu and his colleagues understood the scale of the risk. If the Germans suspected forgery, they would not only ignore the documents, they would begin searching for the real target of the invasion. Moreover, the failure of the operation could undermine the entire British system of deception, including the work of double agents across Europe. This was not a gamble on cleverness, it was a gamble on psychology, on how exactly the enemy would interpret what appeared to be an accidental discovery. By the beginning of the summer of 1943, preparations were complete. One final step remained. The body had to be delivered to the coast of Spain, a country officially neutral but closely connected to German intelligence. If everything went according to plan, the documents would reach the Abwehr. If not, Sicily would become the scene of a far more brutal and bloody battle. And at that moment, an operation that officially did not exist moved from concept into reality. In April 1943, the operation enters a phase where there is no turning back. The body of a man who died in London from poisoning is carefully prepared. Forensic doctors work with precision. The cause of death must appear to be drowning after an aircraft crash. The documents are sealed inside a waterproof briefcase that is secured to the wrist with a chain. Every detail is calculated, from the level of decomposition to the way salt water will affect the paper. The submarine His Majesty's ship Seraph departs from a British port under cover of night. Its commander, Lieutenant Norman Jewell, knows only part of the plan. Inside a cylindrical container on board lies the body of Major William Martin, an officer who never existed. The captain receives his orders. Deliver the cargo to the coast of Spain near the town of Huelva. The location is not accidental. German intelligence networks operate actively there. In the early morning of April 30th, 1943, the submarine surfaces a few kilometers from shore. The sea is calm. The gray sky offers almost no light. The container is opened. The body is carefully dressed in the uniform of a Royal Marine officer. The documents are checked. The briefcase is secured. Everything must look as if the officer died only recently. Jewell reads a short prayer. Then the body is released into the water. Now begins the most anxious phase of the operation. The Allies control nothing from this point forward. They cannot accelerate events. They cannot intervene. The current must carry the body toward the shore. Spanish authorities must discover it. German agents must take interest. Any accident could destroy the entire plan. Within hours, fishermen find the body. Spanish police conduct a formal investigation. The papers are examined, but not officially opened. Yet in Huelva, an agent of the Abwehr is already present. He immediately informs Madrid about the discovery of a British officer carrying a briefcase. From there, events unfold exactly as London anticipated. The documents are secretly copied and passed to the Germans. They describe preparations for an invasion of Greece and Sardinia. Sicily is mentioned only as a diversion. The wording feels natural. The letters contain personal details and subtle references typical of genuine correspondence between officers. Nothing exaggerated, nothing that calls attention to itself. In Berlin, the analysis begins. Intelligence officers compare data, radio intercepts, troop movements, agent reports. Gradually, the picture starts to form. If the documents are genuine, then the main blow will fall on the Balkans. If it is a trap, it is too elaborate and too costly to be believable. The entire operation was built upon that doubt. While staff officers debate and verify details, time moves forward. The Allies wait. They do not know whether the Germans will believe it. They can only watch indirect signs. The transfer of units shifts in priorities within intercepted communications. And at some point it becomes clear. The enemy has begun moving troops. The illusion is starting to work. In Berlin, the documents are examined more than once. They are reviewed by officers of the Abwehr, then by analysts of the High Command of the Armed Forces, and finally by members of Hitler's personal staff. The paper, the signatures, the tone of writing all match British bureaucratic style. The letters appear too personal to be part of a calculated deception. That is precisely what makes them convincing. The lie does not shout, it behaves naturally. Hitler had long suspected that the Allies might use the Balkans as a platform to strike what he called the soft underbelly of Europe. The documents merely confirmed his own fears. And in war, it is especially easy to believe information that aligns with what you already fear. Orders follow quickly, reinforce the defenses of Greece, transfer additional units to the Balkans, increase attention to Sardinia. Sicily no longer appears to be the only direction of the main blow. In May and June of 1943, German divisions begin to move. Armored formations and infantry units receive new routes. Aircraft are reassigned. The strategic map of the Mediterranean shifts. All of this happens not because of a radio intercept and not because of a massive diversion. The reason is a briefcase chained to the wrist of a dead officer. In London, these changes are observed with tension. Radio intercepts reveal new orders. Double agents provide indirect confirmation. But there is no absolute certainty. The Germans could be playing a counter-game. They could pretend to believe. They could keep Sicily reinforced while strengthening the Balkans only symbolically. Until the day of the landing, uncertainty remains. Yet the signs begin to form a clear pattern. German command increasingly focuses on Greece. Positions in the Balkans are strengthened. Sicily remains important, but no longer critical. That is exactly what the British intended. Not total confusion, but a shift in priorities. On the 10th of July, 1943, the Allies launch Operation Husky. More than 160,000 soldiers land in Sicily during the first days of the assault. The defense proves serious, but not as strong as it might have been under full German concentration. Some units are positioned far from the island. Decisions made weeks earlier in Berlin cannot be undone. Sicily gradually comes under Allied control. Within weeks, Mussolini's regime collapses. Italy leaves the war as an ally of Germany. The Mediterranean front changes its balance of power. And at the foundation of this chain of events lies an operation that officially did not exist. The most astonishing aspect of this story is not the scale of troops or the number of ships involved. It is the fragility of the entire structure. If Spanish authorities had refused cooperation, if German analysts had suspected excessive precision in the legend, if even one detail had appeared unnatural, Sicily might have become a very different battle. But war is not only about strength. It is also about the ability to lead the enemy toward a false conclusion. And in 1943, a fictional major of the Royal Marines managed to persuade an entire system to believe in a carefully constructed reality. When the landing in Sicily began, the Allies already understood that the operation had worked. But only now did it become clear how deeply it had worked. German intelligence had not simply reviewed the documents. They had integrated them into their own strategic picture. They did not sense deception. They did exactly what the British had hoped. They believed on their own. Radio intercepts available to London through the system known as Ultra confirmed this indirectly. In messages from German headquarters, Sicily no longer appeared as the primary target. Greece and the Balkans were discussed as the probable center of the offensive. German divisions were held in expectation of a threat that never came. This meant that at the moment of landing, the Allies would face not the maximum possible concentration of forces, but a weakened defense. In Sicily, the fighting was still intense. German and Italian units resisted in an organized and determined manner. But the strategic balance had already been disrupted. Some reserves were positioned far from the island. Decisions made in May on the basis of supposedly accidental documents could not be quickly reversed. Troops cannot be relocated overnight. An error cannot be acknowledged instantly, especially when it has already shaped operational plans. The most delicate moment of the entire operation came after the landing. If the Germans had immediately realized they had been deceived, they could have urgently transferred reinforcements and strengthened resistance. But that did not happen. Even after the Allies secured positions on the island, Berlin continued to treat the Balkans as a potential target of a second blow. The legend of Major Martin continued to function even as he lay buried in a Spanish cemetery. That was the true strength of the operation. It was not a single trick. It was a shift in perception. The British did not falsify one order. They adjusted the expectations of the enemy. They did not force the Germans into a foolish decision. They guided them toward a logical but incorrect conclusion. War rarely forgives such miscalculations. According to historians, the transfer of even a few additional divisions could have significantly complicated the landing in Sicily and increased Allied casualties. Instead, German command distributed forces across a wide front, defending directions that never became battlefields. The illusion proved stronger than reality. When it became obvious that the operation had succeeded, London understood the scale of what had occurred. They had not merely won a tactical episode. They had demonstrated that it was possible to influence the enemy's strategy by shaping its decision-making process, not by destroying it, but by carefully steering it, and all of it rested on details, on theater tickets, on a love letter, on carefully selected dates in official correspondence, a war in which the decisive factor was not artillery, but credibility. And it was here that an operation which officially did not exist became one of the most precise and cold-blooded deceptions of the Second World War. Even after the first successes, the Allies could not be completely certain. Operation Mincemeat relied not only on ingenuity, but also on the reaction of the enemy. In intelligence, there is always risk. The enemy may suspect deception and yet attempt to use the false information for his own purposes. If Berlin had concluded that the documents were deliberately planted, Germany could have maintained its strength in Sicily while simultaneously reinforcing the Balkans. In that case, the landing might have turned into a prolonged and exhausting battle with an unpredictable outcome. A crucial factor was the behavior of the Spanish authorities. Spain officially maintained neutrality, but its security services were closely connected with German intelligence. The British expected that the documents would be secretly opened and passed to the Germans, and then carefully returned to the briefcase in order to preserve the illusion of official handling. That is exactly what happened. The papers were returned in almost perfect condition, yet microscopic examination revealed signs that they had been opened. That meant one thing: the documents had been read. Now everything depended on how they would be interpreted in Berlin. The Germans did not simply accept the information blindly. They began to verify it through indirect methods. They compared movements of Allied convoys. They analyzed diplomatic signals. They studied activity in the Eastern Mediterranean. And the more data they gathered, the more logical the scenario of a strike against Greece appeared. The legend did not stand alone. It fit neatly into existing fears. That was the central strength of the operation. It did not impose a new reality. It reinforced old anxieties. Hitler had long feared an invasion of the Balkans. The documents carried by Major Martin provided the confirmation that had been missing. Sometimes a lie works precisely because it aligns with expectations. The landing in Sicily demonstrated that strategic deception can be more precise than artillery fire. The Allies did not destroy German divisions in advance. They caused them to stand in places where they were useless. It was a rare case in which an intelligence operation altered the distribution of forces across an entire region. When Sicily fell, the consequences extended far beyond the island. On the 25th of July, 1943, Mussolini was removed from power. Italy began negotiations to leave the war. Germany was forced to urgently strengthen its positions on the Italian peninsula. The Mediterranean strategy of the Third Reich began to fracture, and that fracture began with a briefcase chained to the wrist of a dead man. The operation ended successfully, but its true power became clear only later. It proved that in modern war, reality can be constructed, not loudly and not dramatically, but through trust, through details that appear too real to be fiction. And in 1943, the Allies demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful blow is delivered not from the sea and not from the air, but inside the mind of the enemy. After the landing in Sicily, the operation continued to live a life of its own for some time. Even when it became clear that the Allies were not going to attack Greece, German command was slow to admit error. War does not allow leaders to easily abandon decisions that have already been made. Too many resources had been transferred. Too many orders had been issued. Too much now depended on the original logic being correct. In Berlin, they preferred to believe that Sicily was only the first stage, that the real blow was still ahead. This meant that the units transferred to the Balkans remained there, tying down forces and resources. The illusion created by British intelligence did not disappear immediately. It continued to influence the thinking of the enemy even when facts began to contradict it. For the British, this became a rare moment when the results of intelligence work could be measured not through reports, but through the movement of armies. German divisions were positioned where they should not have been. Aircraft were assigned in response to a threat that did not exist. Enemy planning was built upon a false assumption. That was exactly what London had intended. Not an instant effect, but a lasting distortion of the picture of war. Major William Martin was already buried in Spain with military honors. On his grave stood the name of a man who had never existed. Not a single German officer who studied the documents from his briefcase knew that he had become part of a carefully staged performance. And that was the irony of the operation. The more seriously it was taken in Berlin, the more effective it became. Operation Mincemeat proved that intelligence can be more than a supporting element of war. It can be an independent strategic weapon. It did not win a battle directly. It changed the conditions under which that battle was fought. The Allies did not become stronger. The enemy became weaker where it mattered most. Later, British officers admitted that what frightened them most was not the complexity of the plan, but its simplicity. The entire operation rested on one assumption, that the enemy would think rationally, that he would examine the documents carefully, yet ultimately believe what appeared logical. It was a dangerous assumption, but it proved to be correct. The Second World War is often portrayed as a clash of industry, numbers, and technology. But Operation Mincemeat revealed another dimension of the conflict. War is also a struggle of interpretation, a struggle over what conclusions the enemy will draw when faced with the same set of facts. And in 1943, one carefully constructed human story proved stronger than divisions, fortifications, and artillery. Because it forced an entire system to make the wrong decision and to continue believing in it even as reality began to unravel the illusion that had been created. The capture of Sicily was more than a tactical victory. It triggered a chain reaction that could no longer be stopped. The island, once considered a natural barrier, had been breached. The Mediterranean was no longer a secure corridor for Germany. But most importantly, the political structure that supported the fascist regime in Italy began to collapse. On the 25th of July, 1943, Benito Mussolini was removed from power and arrested. Italy began secret negotiations to leave the war. Germany was forced to urgently transfer troops to the Italian peninsula in order to hold the southern flank of Europe. All of this meant a redistribution of forces, resources, and strategic priorities. The front expanded. Pressure on the Third Reich intensified. Operation Mincemeat was not the only factor behind these events, but it altered the starting conditions. If Sicily had been reinforced to its maximum capacity, if German divisions had been fully concentrated on the island, the landing might have been prolonged, Allied losses might have increased, and the political consequences might have unfolded more slowly. War rarely depends on a single decision, but it is sensitive to balance. And that balance had been disrupted. For German command, the operation became a lesson understood too late. The intelligence officers of the Abwehr did not make an obvious mistake in examining the documents. They acted rationally. They analyzed and compared data. But their system of interpretation was vulnerable. It searched for confirmation of existing assumptions and found it where it had been deliberately constructed. This is an important point. The operation did not succeed because the Germans were incompetent. It succeeded because even a well-organized intelligence system tends to trust information that aligns with its expectations. Strategic decisions are not made in isolation. They are shaped by probabilities, fears, and prior beliefs. British intelligence managed to embed its deception into an already existing narrative. In a broader sense, the operation demonstrated that modern war increasingly depends on the management of information. At the beginning of the conflict, armored breakthroughs and airstrikes played the decisive role. But by 1943, the ability to influence the thinking of the enemy had become central. Deception was no longer a supporting tool. It had become part of strategic planning. After the war, many details of the operation remained classified. Only in 1953 did Ewan Montagu publish a book in which he partially revealed the story of Major Martin. Even then, not everything was disclosed. Some aspects of the operation remained secret for decades. This too is characteristic of such operations. Their success often depends on the enemy never fully understanding how he was deceived. From the perspective of military history, the operation became an example of how a small group of individuals can influence the distribution of divisions, fleets, and aircraft. Not by destroying them directly, but by altering their direction. It was an intervention at the highest level of decision-making. That is why Operation Mincemeat is still studied in intelligence academies. Not as a curiosity and not as a clever trick, but as a model of strategic disinformation. It demonstrated that sometimes it is more effective not to attack a fortified position, but to make the enemy abandon it himself. The tactical success in Sicily was the visible outcome, but the deeper impact of the operation lay elsewhere. It revealed that war is increasingly fought not only for territory, but for interpretation of reality. And the one who controls that interpretation gains an advantage before the first shot is fired. Major William Martin remained a man without a past. His name is carved on a gravestone in the Spanish town of Huelva, yet behind it there is no family, no service record, no memories. It was a carefully constructed biography, designed down to the smallest detail, from a theater ticket in his pocket to a photograph of his fiancée. He never lived, yet he played a role that altered the course of a campaign. After the war, Ewan Montagu and his colleagues returned to ordinary life. Some continued their service, others moved into civilian careers. Their work remained in the shadows for a long time. Only years later did it become clear how fragile the entire structure of the operation had been. One incorrect conclusion, one suspicious detail, and Sicily might have turned into a bloody disaster. The story of the operation reminds us that war is not only a clash of armies. It is a struggle for trust, for interpretation of facts, for the decisions made in the silence of headquarters. Sometimes the fate of thousands of soldiers depends on whether the enemy believes in a letter written with ink that never truly dried in real life. Today, Operation Mincemeat is studied as a classic example of strategic disinformation. It demonstrated that human psychology can be as much a battlefield as the sea or the air. If you lead the enemy to a false conclusion, you have already changed the future. And there is a paradox in that. A man who never existed became more influential than many real officers. His story is a reminder that in war, the decisive factor may not be a shot fired, but trust placed in a piece of paper. If this story has made you see the Second World War differently, support the video. Every view and every comment help preserve stories like this from being forgotten. Because even fictional names sometimes deserve remembrance as symbols of how thin the line can be between truth and a carefully constructed illusion.